The Korean War was a brutal and devastating conflict that took place from 1950 to 1953. It was fought between North Korea, backed by communist nations like China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea, supported by Western powers, primarily the United States, as part of the broader Cold War. The wars primarily fought over control of the Korean peninsula and represented the larger ideological battle between capitalist nations and communist regimes.
Following the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan's influence in the peninsula grew, until Korea became a nominal protectorate in 1905. Following this, in 1910, Japan formally annexed the peninsula. Throughout Japanese rule in Korea, from 1910 to 1945, Koreans were not treated fairly. Their names were banned, their languages were discouraged, and their culture was suppressed. This was part of a greater Japanese policy towards cultural assimilation. With Korean cultural suppression, various nationalist movements popped up, though to no avail. Throughout Japanese rule, many Koreans were forced into labor in jobs like manufacturing and agriculture, which galvanized Korean industry, bringing great benefit to Japan while Korea was unable to feed from the fruits of their own labor. This oppression worsened as Japan entered World War II, and many more were forced into factory jobs to aid the war effort. By 1945, Korea was both politically and economically shattered, after 45 years of Japanese rule, the catalyst calling for a switch of power being Japan's defeat in the Second World War. The two Allied powers most capable of managing the situation, the Soviet Union and the US, decided to temporarily divide Korea along the 38th parallel. The North, called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, was controlled by the Soviets, and the South, or Republic of Korea, by the Americans. In 1948, Korea became two independent states, led by Kim Il-sung in the North, which adopted communism, and Syngman Rhee in the South, which aligned with capitalism in the US. Over time, the 38th parallel came to symbolize much more than just a border. It summed up the ideological divide between communism and capitalism, a divide that's worsened since the war.
The North Korean forces, led under Kim Il-sung, referred to as the KPA or Korean People's Army, and supplied by Soviet weaponry, launched a surprise attack on the morning of June 25, 1950. The Republic of Korea, caught off guard from the sudden onslaught, quickly retreated deep into the heart of South Korea. This officially marked the beginning of the Korean War, and both sides declared war on each other. The Southern Forces, or the Republic of Korean Army, abbreviated ROKA, were pushed all the way back to the Pusan perimeter in the southeast. The Korean People's Army, abbreviated KPA, continued to exert force. At this time, the ROKA was poorly equipped and outnumbered by the North, likely due to the struggles of a post-colonial state. The South Korean capital, Seoul, was immediately captured with lightning-fast ease. This served as a psychological blow to the south, and Syngman Rhee fled to the southeast.
Following the invasion of South Korea, the UN advised that all hostilities in the region be ceased. Following this, 2 days later, they recommended that member countries provide assistance to the Republic of Korea in order to restore international peace. Days later, they established the UN Command, a military composed of soldiers from member nations all fighting under the UN flag. They were under US command, and most forces were American. This is the only example of the UN directly participating in a full-scale military campaign.
The Inchon Landing was an amphibious invasion of Inchon, a port city on the west coast of South Korea, near the capital city Seoul. At this point in the war, South Korea was dangerously close to falling to the Soviets. Only about 5% of the Korean peninsula was controlled by the South. Despite the lost situation, U.S. military official General MacArthur had an idea. He hoped to cut off the Korean People's Army supplies and force them to retreat back into North Korea. The complex tides and unexpected swells made it an extremely risky operation. Finally, on September 15, 1950, the UN forces, primarily composed of U.S. Army Marines, landed at Inchon. The KPA was caught off guard for the sudden bombardment and failed to stop a beach landing. Soldiers stormed onto the beach and quickly captured the city of Inchon. The success from the landing pushed the KPA all the way back to the 38th parallel, and Seoul was recaptured for the Southern forces. The Battle of Inchon marked a significant turning point in the Korean War. However, the war was far from over.
The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, led by dictator Mao Zedong, sympathized with the Soviet cause, and were worried that American influence would spread among Asia and feared a potential US invasion of China. They had already put military advisors in North Korea, but then eventually decided to send troops to fight in support of the KPA after UN forces came dangerously close to the Yalu River, a landmark extremely close to the Chinese-North Korean border. This advancement sent panic through the CCP, as they feared a potential American invasion. The Chinese Volunteer Army, abbreviated CVA, was the Chinese fighting forces. The intervention significantly turned the tide of the war into the North's favor and halted the momentum of the UN movement.
The Battle of Chosin Reservoir occurred a couple months after the Chinese put troops in Korea. The UN forces, which was primarily composed of US Marines but also various British regiments, were advancing through North Korea, gaining ground towards the Chinese border when they were confronted with a Chinese offensive. The battle was fought under incredibly harsh conditions, temperatures plummeting to around -35 degrees Fahrenheit, with deep snow and freezing winds. This created a unique set of challenges, as many suffered from widespread frostbite and weapon jams. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, under the command of General Song Shilhun, launched a surprise attack on the UN forces, enveloping them in a series of coordinated assaults. The Marines were cut off from their supply lines and surrounded by tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers, who were skilled in guerrilla tactics and used their knowledge of the terrain to inflict significant damage. Despite being severely outnumbered and under extreme environmental stress, the Marines fought tenaciously. However, they were forced to withdraw from the Chosin Reservoir area in what is known as a fighting withdrawal. Finally, the Marines managed to break through the Chinese lines and march 78 miles south to the port of Hungnam, where they were evacuated by sea. The retreat was harrowing, but it allowed the UN forces to preserve their fighting strength. This would be the greatest defeat by UN forces in the war, and it was crucial for the Chinese in driving the UN out of the north. By 1951, the Korean War had reached a stalemate. The intense fighting had resulted in both sides suffering heavy casualties, but neither the United Nations forces, led under the United States, nor the North Korean and Chinese forces could win a decisive victory. The military situation on the ground had stabilized by 1950. The front lines had remained roughly along the 30th parallel, the pre-war border between North and South Korea. Despite some skirmishes, neither side was able to push each other out of their own territory. The war had essentially turned into a war of attrition, with neither side willing to make significant territorial concessions. The deadlock made both sides realize that the war could not be won through military strength, making both parties consider peace negotiations. Peace talks officially began in July 1951 in Kaesong, located in North Korea. However, these negotiations were slow and difficult, as both sides had extremely entrenched positions. The key issues included the status of prisoners of war and the establishment of a stable ceasefire line. Over the course of 2 years, the talks were marred by delays, accusations, and stalled negotiations, but both sides recognized the importance of ending the war. The United States, led under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, put pressure on the communist forces, while China and North Korea sought a face-saving way to end the conflict. Finally, on July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. This agreement effectively ended the fighting, though it did not result in a formal peace treaty. The armistice created a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, around the 38th parallel, which remains today as a buffer between North and South Korea. The agreement also called for the repatriation of prisoners of war and established a framework for future peace talks.
The Korean War had lots of cultural impacts on 1950s America, and most importantly exacerbated the effects of the Red Scare. The Red Scare was an event in America that consisted of widespread paranoia about communism and communist sympathizers. This led to an increase in government surveillance in search of communists, which helped bring the Cold War to the forefront of American culture and news. In addition, throughout the war, support among the American public dwindled, as later on the war stood at a standstill, and yet American men still died for no clear objective. This anti-war sentiment paved the way for the legendary anti-war protests during the American conflict in Vietnam, being forever cemented in popular culture.